3 weeks ago, I found myself in Brussels, sitting inside a closed-door meeting with senior European finance officials. The discussion was confidential, tense, and focused on one subject alone: sanctions on Russia. At one point, a high-ranking official leaned forward and said something I will never forget. He said, "We believed freezing Russian assets would cripple them. Instead, we have unleashed a force we no longer control." He was absolutely right. What Europe has done with Russian assets has triggered consequences far bigger than anyone expected. This decision is now setting off a chain reaction that could permanently reshape the global financial system. What you are about to hear is not being openly discussed in mainstream reporting, and once you understand it, you will realize why this move may go down as one of the most serious strategic mistakes in modern financial history. On February 26, 2022, the European Union took an unprecedented step. It froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. This was something the world had never seen before. Western nations had sanctioned countries in the past, but they had never frozen the sovereign reserves of a major global power. For nearly 2 years, those assets remained locked, untouched, while European leaders debated what to do next. Then, in May 2024, a decision was finally made. Europe announced it would not confiscate the principal amount, but it would seize the interest generated by those frozen funds. Roughly $3 billion per year would be redirected to Ukraine as military aid. When I first heard this plan, it was immediately clear to me that it was a disaster in the making. You cannot partially take someone's money and expect them to stay silent. There is no such thing as a half measure in financial warfare. European policymakers believed they had found a clever compromise. They would preserve the original assets while extracting the profits. In their minds, this seemed like a balanced solution, but finance does not work that way. Either property rights are respected or they are not. Once that line is crossed, the consequences are unavoidable. Russia's response was swift and calculated. Within 48 hours of the EU's announcement, Moscow issued a retaliatory decree. Any European company holding assets inside Russia was now at risk. The message was simple and brutal. If Europe seizes Russian wealth, Russia will seize an equivalent amount of European wealth. Not more, not less. A mirror response. The scale of exposure shocked European leaders. Volkswagen alone holds approximately $3.5 billion in Russian assets. Raiffeisen Bank has nearly $2.8 billion. Danone around $1.2 billion. Add to that companies like Société Générale, Unilever, Shell, and BP. In total, European corporate exposure in Russia exceeds $200 billion. Russia is not threatening to take all of it. That is what makes this strategy so effective. Moscow is targeting exactly the amount Europe took, around $15 billion. This precision is no accident. It sends a clear signal that retaliation will be proportional, deliberate, and legally framed within Russian jurisdiction. European governments are now panicking because their largest corporations are in open revolt. Volkswagen cannot casually write off billions. Raiffeisen could face solvency risks. These companies employ thousands of workers and hold enormous political influence. They are demanding action from their governments. This has placed European leaders in an impossible position. They seized Russian state assets to support Ukraine, but now their own private sector is paying the price. The backlash is internal, political, and growing stronger by the day. What makes Russia's response particularly effective is its selectivity. Moscow is not targeting companies at random. It is focusing on firms from countries that were most aggressive in pushing for confiscation. German, French, and Austrian companies are bearing the brunt. Meanwhile, companies from countries that expressed hesitation about sanctions, Hungary being a prime example, are largely untouched. This tactic is deepening fractures within the European Union. Nations that supported restraint are effectively being rewarded, while the most vocal advocates of confiscation are suffering the consequences. Russia is not confronting Europe as a single entity, it is exploiting internal divisions, and the strategy is working. But this story goes far beyond Europe and Russia. The real impact is unfolding quietly across the global financial system. For over 72 decades, the Western financial order was built on one core principle: property rights are inviolable. If you held assets in Western banks or jurisdictions, those assets were considered safe. Governments could regulate or tax them, but outright seizure was unthinkable. That principle effectively ended in February 2022 and was buried in May 2024. Today, central banks around the world are asking a dangerous question. If it happened to Russia, could it happen to us? The answer is obvious, and it terrifies them. I have personally spoken with central bank officials from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Every single one is reassessing their reserve strategies. Most global reserves are held in dollars and euros, parked inside Western institutions. That now looks like a vulnerability rather than a safeguard. As a result, a quiet but massive shift is underway. Central banks are reducing exposure to Western currencies. Gold reserves are increasing. Bilateral trade agreements are replacing dollar-based settlements. Alternative payment systems are being built outside Western control. This is not theoretical. It is happening now. The real cost of Europe's decision is not the $105 billion headline figure. It is the trillions of dollars in global reserves that will gradually move away from Western jurisdictions in the coming decade. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. And this is only the beginning.
The consequences of this decision are no longer theoretical. They are unfolding in real time, quietly but relentlessly, across global markets and central banks. While European leaders focus on short-term political messaging, the rest of the world is making long-term strategic adjustments. These adjustments are driven by one realization: Western financial systems are no longer neutral custodians of wealth. They are political tools, and tools can be turned against you. Every central bank governor understands this instinctively. Reserves are not just numbers on a balance sheet. They are a nation's insurance policy against crisis. They represent stability, sovereignty, and survival. When those reserves can be frozen or partially seized based on political alignment, they cease to function as true reserves. They become conditional assets, safe as long as you remain politically compliant. This is why diversification has accelerated at a pace never seen before. Not announced, not celebrated, but executed quietly. Dollar and euro holdings are being trimmed month after month. Gold purchases are rising steadily, not because gold is perfect, but because it cannot be frozen by a foreign court or seized by a foreign government with a keystroke. Physical assets held domestically or in neutral jurisdictions suddenly look far more attractive than digital balances held abroad. Alongside gold, bilateral currency arrangements are expanding rapidly. Countries are choosing to trade directly in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar altogether. This reduces exposure to sanctions, lowers dependency on Western clearing systems, and restores a degree of financial autonomy. What once seemed inefficient or symbolic is now viewed as essential risk management. Payment infrastructure is also changing. Alternative settlement systems are being developed that operate independently of Western-controlled networks. These systems may not yet rival the scale or efficiency of existing ones, but they do not need to. They only need to exist. Once an alternative is viable, even if imperfect, the monopoly is broken. And once the monopoly is broken, power shifts. Europe did not anticipate this acceleration. They believed financial dominance was permanent, that the world had no realistic substitute for Western systems. What they underestimated was motivation.
When survival and sovereignty are at stake, nations are willing to accept short-term inefficiencies in exchange for long-term independence. History shows this pattern repeatedly, and finance is no exception. The irony is painful. Europe assumed Russia would be isolated, weakened, and desperate. Instead, Russia has adapted, redirected trade, and weaponized the very precedent Europe created. By responding with measured, proportional retaliation, Moscow has demonstrated that financial coercion is not a one-way street. It can be mirrored, it can be neutralized, and, most importantly, it can backfire. Western policymakers often assume that economic logic will override political considerations, but this crisis proves the opposite. Once trust is broken, rational economic behavior changes. Investors, governments, and institutions begin prioritizing safety over efficiency, control over returns, and independence over integration. These shifts are slow, but they are cumulative, and they are extremely difficult to reverse. This brings us to the question of credibility. For decades, Western financial centers thrived because they offered something invaluable: predictability, rule of law, neutrality. Capital flowed into London, New York, and Frankfurt not because they were the most politically powerful, but because they were perceived as safe havens beyond politics. That perception has now been severely damaged. When assets can be frozen based on geopolitical disputes, neutrality disappears. Financial centers become extensions of state power, and capital does not willingly reside inside a weapon. It seeks distance, insulation, and plausible deniability. This is why alternative hubs are gaining momentum. Cities that position themselves as politically neutral, commercially pragmatic, and legally predictable are becoming increasingly attractive. This shift is not dramatic or sudden. It does not make headlines. It happens quietly through balance sheet decisions, corporate relocations, and long-term investment strategies. But over time, it reshapes the map of global finance. The center of gravity moves not because of ideology, but because of risk calculations. European leaders argue that moral justification overweighs financial consequences. They claim that extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary measures. But markets do not operate on morality. They operate on incentives, precedent, and expectations. Once a precedent is set, it becomes part of the risk model. And once that risk is priced in, capital behaves accordingly. The most damaging aspect of this episode is not the immediate retaliation or the corporate losses. It is the lesson being learned by every non-Western country watching closely. The lesson is simple. Your assets are only safe until they are politically inconvenient. That lesson will shape policy decisions for decades. It is also reshaping alliances. Countries that once aligned economically with the West are now hedging their bets. They are not openly abandoning Western systems, but they are reducing dependence. This creates a more fragmented, multipolar financial world where influence is diluted and leverage is harder to exert. The West relied heavily on financial sanctions as a substitute for military force. It was seen as a cleaner, safer way to project power. But sanctions only work when alternatives do not exist. By accelerating the creation of alternatives, Europe has weakened its own most effective non-military weapon. Russia understands this dynamic. Its response is not emotional. It is instructional. It is designed to show the world that resistance is possible, that retaliation can be symmetrical, and that compliance is not the only option. This message resonates far beyond Russia's borders. As more countries internalize this lesson, the effectiveness of future sanctions diminishes. Threats lose credibility. Financial pressure becomes less decisive, and the cost of enforcement rises dramatically. What once required a policy announcement may soon require constant escalation. Europe did not just challenge Russia, it challenged the foundational trust underpinning global finance. And once that trust erodes, rebuilding it takes generations, not press releases. Markets remember, institutions remember, governments remember. The tragedy is that the immediate gains are minimal.
A few billion dollars per year will not alter the military balance in Ukraine. It will not end the war. It will not force a strategic capitulation. But the long-term costs will be immense, diffuse, and irreversible. This is how empires decline, not with collapse, but with accumulation of miscalculations. Each decision seems justified in isolation. Each consequence appears manageable, but together they form a pattern of overreach, and overreach always carries a price. By turning financial infrastructure into a battlefield, Europe has ensured that future conflicts will be fought not just with weapons, but with balance sheets, reserves, and payment systems. The world is adjusting accordingly. The process has already begun, and there is no clear path back. And the most dangerous part is this. The full impact will only be visible years from now, when the capital has already moved, the systems have already changed, and the leverage Europe once had is gone forever.
What we are witnessing now is not a temporary reaction, but a structural transformation. Financial systems evolve slowly, almost invisibly, until one day the change becomes undeniable. Europe's asset seizure has become one of those inflection points. It forced countries, corporations, and investors to confront a reality they had long ignored. Financial power, once weaponized, loses its credibility as a neutral force. At the heart of this transformation is confidence. Money is not just currency or numbers on a ledger, it is trust institutionalized. People and governments place their wealth in certain systems because they believe those systems will treat them fairly, predictably, and consistently, regardless of political tensions. When that belief collapses, money moves, not dramatically, not overnight, but decisively. This is why the response from the non-Western world has been so revealing. There is no outrage, no moral condemnation, no emotional rhetoric. Instead, there is quiet calculation. Finance ministries are running scenarios. Central banks are rewriting reserve strategies. Legal teams are reassessing jurisdictional exposure. This is how serious actors behave when they believe the rules of the game have changed. One of the most significant developments is the redefinition of safe assets. For decades, safety meant Western government bonds, Western banks, Western clearing systems. Today, safety increasingly means assets beyond Western legal reach. Gold stored domestically, trade settled in local currencies, infrastructure controlled by national or regional institutions rather than global ones. This does not mean the dollar or euro will disappear. That narrative is simplistic and wrong. What is happening is far more subtle and far more damaging to Western influence. The world is moving from dependence to optionality. When countries have options, leverage weakens. When leverage weakens, power must be exercised more carefully or it dissipates. Russia's role in this shift is often misunderstood. This is not about Russia winning or losing in the short term. It is about Russia demonstrating a principle, the principle that financial coercion is not absolute, that retaliation is possible, that compliance is not the only rational response. This demonstration is being studied carefully by every country that has ever felt vulnerable to Western pressure. The effectiveness of Russia's response lies in its restraint. By matching Europe's seizure amount precisely, Moscow avoided appearing reckless or vindictive. It framed its actions as defensive, reciprocal, and legally grounded. This matters enormously in finance, where perception and legitimacy are as important as raw power. European policymakers underestimated this dimension. They assumed moral framing would carry the day, but markets do not respond to morality. They respond to precedent, and the precedent now established is deeply unsettling for anyone holding assets under Western jurisdiction. The long-term implication is a world where financial fragmentation accelerates. Instead of one dominant system, we see multiple overlapping systems. Instead of universal rules, we see regional standards. Instead of centralized control, we see distributed networks. This reduces efficiency, increases transaction costs, and makes crises harder to manage collectively. Ironically, these outcomes harm Europe more than they harm their adversaries. Europe benefited enormously from globalization, from open capital flows, from being perceived as a stable anchor in a volatile world. By undermining that perception, Europe has weakened one of its greatest strategic advantages. Corporate consequences are already visible. Multinational companies are rethinking where they invest, where they hold cash, where they base headquarters, and which jurisdictions they trust for long-term stability. These decisions are not reversed easily. Once a company restructures its global footprint, it rarely returns to the previous configuration. Financial centers rise and fall based on reputation. That reputation is built over decades and destroyed far more quickly. When neutrality disappears, competition intensifies. Other cities are eager to capture capital that feels unwelcome or unsafe elsewhere. They are positioning themselves carefully, emphasizing predictability, non-alignment, and legal independence. This shift also changes how future conflicts will be managed. Financial sanctions were once seen as a deterrent, a way to impose costs without bloodshed. But deterrence only works when the threat is credible and the response asymmetric. If targets can retaliate proportionately, deterrence weakens. Sanctions become just another escalation step rather than a decisive tool. The world is learning this lesson in real time. Every government now understands that financial warfare invites financial counter-warfare, that escalation is no longer contained, that once the door is opened, it cannot be closed selectively. This realization will shape diplomatic strategies for generations. There is also a deeper philosophical cost. The Western financial system claimed legitimacy by presenting itself as rule-based rather than power-based. Rules applied universally, not selectively. That claim has been seriously compromised. When exceptions become normalized, rules lose authority. This does not mean the West has no influence left. It still commands enormous economic power, technological advantage, and institutional depth. But influence is most effective when it is invisible, when it is accepted rather than imposed. Weaponizing finance makes power visible, and visible power invites resistance. History is full of examples where dominant systems collapsed not because they were defeated outright, but because they became too coercive. They relied increasingly on force rather than consent. Financial dominance follows the same pattern. Once participation feels compulsory rather than beneficial, alternatives flourish. Europe's decision may feel justified in the context of war and morality, but financial systems operate on longer timelines. The damage done today will echo long after the conflict ends. Capital will remember, institutions will remember, and the world will not easily forget who crossed the line first. In the end, this episode will be remembered primarily not as a response to a specific conflict. It will be remembered as the moment the illusion of Western financial neutrality finally collapsed. The moment that the rest of the world began, in earnest, to design a system where no single bloc holds the keys. Russia's response will be analyzed not for its legality or morality, but for its strategic clarity. It exposed a vulnerability that had been ignored for decades. It showed that power invites counterpower, and it reminded the world that even the most sophisticated systems are only as strong as the trust that sustains them.
Once that trust is broken, no amount of regulation, rhetoric, or reassurance can fully restore it. The global financial order is entering a new phase, less centralized, less predictable, and far more contested. And Europe, by its own hand, helped push it there.